Okay, so we've talked about plague, we've talked about the beginning of the Age of Exploration, and now we're into Act 2. Act 2 is smallpox and related diseases, okay? So today we're going to talk about what happened when the Europeans crossed the Atlantic Ocean and arrive in the Americas. And of course, the famous person that you start off with is Christopher Columbus, who crossed the ocean in 1492. Now, who was Christopher Columbus? Christopher Columbus was an Italian cartographer and privateer, okay? A privateer is a pirate that works for the government, okay? So Christopher Columbus was basically a mercenary who looted ships for the Italian government. He kind of moved around Europe a lot, and he was living in Portugal in 1484, where he says, hey, he goes to the king and says, I think I can get to the West Indies in a different way, right? Now, he thought he was going to India. Maybe. Probably didn't know exactly where he was going, but it was a pretty good, people knew that the earth was round at the time and that you could get around probably from one side to the other, okay? So the idea that he thought the earth was flat and he might fall off, that's not true. He kind of knew he wasn't going to do that. I don't think he really understood how big earth was. There was no way he was getting to India that way, even if there was no Americas in the middle, right? I mean, the Pacific Ocean is like half the planet. But anyway, he wanted to go out and see. And Portugal goes, what? No, that's weird. We've been funding, missions to go check out Africa, but we can basically see Africa from our house, right? It's right there. No, I don't want to fund your weird expedition. So a few years later, he moves to Spain and tries again with the Spanish government. And Spanish government says no. And then he tries again. And they're like, no. And then in 1492, he tries a fourth time, and basically, this time his hook is, if I take a missionary and we convert all the Indian people to Christianity, wouldn't that be, important for your realm? And the queen, she was swayed by this argument. So as long as you take missionaries, you can go do this thing, okay? So he gets his ships together, and he goes across the ocean. And he ends up in the Caribbean, right? Now, in the Caribbean, you had the Taino people, okay? Taino, the Native Americans of the Caribbean islands. It's estimated there are about 2 to 3 million people, Tainos, in the Caribbean when Columbus arrived, all right? Pretty well-populated area. And so these were the first people that Columbus came in contact with. And here's what he had to say about them. They will give all that they do possess for anything that is given to them, exchanging things even for bits of broken crockery. They do not carry arms or know them. They should be good servants. So, yeah, his first thought upon meeting new people who were really kind and nice to him was that he could easily enslave them. So let's just, kind of cut the crap. Columbus wasn't a good guy, okay? And there are arguments to be made about whether we should venerate any of the early explorers or conquistadors, whether it was right or wrong for any of that to happen. What does it mean? What does our heritage mean to, balance all of these different settler society issues and all of that? But aside from all of that, Columbus himself was not a good guy, okay? Columbus himself was not worthy of veneration, okay? If you want to talk about Amerigo Vespucci, that's a different conversation because Columbus is a documented genocidal maniac. He enslaved thousands of Tainos, okay? As soon as they got there, they were enslaving them. They were killing them for fun. They were raping them, torturing them, mutilating them. If you really want nightmares, go find the diary of the people the priests that he brought along with him. Because guess what? This was not what they imagined as a missionary kind of thing. This isn't what they thought they were signing up for. This isn't what they came to do. In some cases, you have an estimated 50,000 Tainos that committed suicide by jumping off cliffs when the Spanish got there and they couldn't defend themselves anymore. And so Christopher Columbus was widely disliked in his own time. This isn't something where we're like, oh, yeah, he was actually an asshole, but everybody loved him back then. Like, people didn't like him back then. The Spanish living in the colonies, once they started colonizing, like San Domingo and stuff, were like, this guy's crazy. We do not want him in charge. We hate having this guy around, okay? And he was actually arrested and imprisoned for torture in Spain after his third voyage, him and his brother. And he had friends in high places, so he was let out. But, like, it's important to understand that what he was doing was recognized as torture at the time he was alive. This is not he was a product of his time. No, I mean, we all are products of our time to a certain extent, but he was on the brutal end of it, okay? He was breaking the laws, he was breaking social norms. Christopher Columbus, not a great guy, all right? So that's why you'll see his statues being pulled down and spattered with red paint and that kind of thing quite frequently. So, obviously the Spanish were the first to get to kind of this area and start colonizing. So the Spanish came into Hispaniola, which is the island which contains Santo Domingo and what would later become Haiti, all right? Puerto Rico, Cuba, San Salvador. So the Spanish get in and they're kind of poking around. Within the first 100 years of the Spanish being in the Americas, however, 75 to 90% of the Taino were killed by European diseases. In 100 years. Okay, so the word decimate actually means to reduce to a tenth of. That is the literal definition of it. So European diseases very quickly decimated the Taino population. Okay, so European diseases. What are these European diseases? Well, there are many, but we're going to talk about three. The big one is smallpox. Okay? So smallpox is an ancient disease. It's been found in Egyptian mummies. Smallpox has been around a long time. Smallpox is most likely related to our livestock. All of these diseases are that we just have livestock around and we're swapping diseases and things emerge, okay? These are the diseases that I talk about with the civilization, the diseases of civilization. Often are kind of smallpox and typhoid and influenza. So, smallpox starts with flu-like symptoms. You'll notice most diseases have flu-like symptoms at first. That's because flu-like symptoms are your immune system working. That's all. That's all. That's the only reason. It's just your immune system kicking in and trying to work. Often you will start getting rash, blisters, and permanent scarring if you survive smallpox. So these two boys here, both were in the same situation, both exposed to smallpox. The boy on the right had the vaccination and the boy on the left did not. So smallpox was the first vaccine created. Smallpox, very few people who are still alive remember smallpox being a huge problem. It had a 30% mortality rate. So that's an amazingly high mortality rate, okay? And during the 20th century, it killed 500 million people. Smallpox really was a major scourge. It was eradicated by 1980. It was eradicated by 1980 because in the early 20th century, you had a vaccine. It was really the first, like I said, the first vaccine that was really created. And you had decades of sustained quarantining, contact tracing, and vaccination programs that eventually, all around the world, okay, were able to stop the transmission of smallpox. We haven't had a new smallpox case in, I think, 40 years or something like that, 50 years, which is amazing. There still is smallpox. Only 2 countries have it. The United States and Russia have samples of smallpox. Both of them have done stupid things with their samples of smallpox. So there was an explosion at a Russian lab with smallpox in it last year. It doesn't seem like the smallpox was, affected, but still, like, ugh. We, on the other hand, lost a vial of smallpox in a broom closet for a long time, and a couple of years ago, an intern at the CDC was cleaning out the closet and was like, hey, y'all, is this important? And it was smallpox, the only eradicated disease. So, it's important to understand smallpox is the only disease we've ever eliminated out of the human population, but because we tried to eliminate it. However, it does still exist, and if it were to somehow get out now, like in a bioterrorism situation, it would be very, very, very bad for us because we don't have smallpox vaccinations. Most people under 50, some don't get smallpox vaccinations because it was already gone, right? You don't need a vaccination for something that's not in circulation. But that means we don't have protection from it if it comes back somehow. So while smallpox was kind of the big one, you'll hear people talk about smallpox blankets, smallpox all the time. Smallpox was a big contributor to killing Native people in the Americas. So was influenza, or the flu, okay? And of course, people have been talking about influenza since COVID started all over the place. And I think influenza is poorly understood. So influenza is also an ancient disease. Influenza was first documented probably by the Chinese in 6000 BC. Hippocrates, right, the ancient Greek who was responsible for our modern kind of idea of medical ethics, was treating influenza. It's kind of been with us this whole time. It kills generally between 250,000 to a little over 500,000 people worldwide per year. Now, flu numbers range widely because generally the flu makes you feel like crap, but you don't necessarily go to the doctor for it. Very few people in the world get tested to see if they have flu unless it's very, very serious or there's something like they're trying to rule out COVID. And again, so many diseases have flu-like symptoms that really accounting for flu is very difficult. But we know that your probability of getting flu is very high and your probability of dying from flu is very low. So that makes it a very difficult counting problem. And the Spanish flu mortality was very high. People keep talking about the Spanish flu outbreak. In the Spanish flu outbreak, it was anywhere between 4 and maybe even 10% mortality, depending on where you were. But usually the flu's mortality rate is closer to 0.01%. So much less deadly than even COVID. Now, one of the things that makes the flu extremely effective at its job is that it evolves rapidly. So you have to get a vaccine every year because every year there's new strains. All right? So there's new strains developing constantly. When you get a flu shot, it's a shot that should cover 3 or 4 of the most popular flu strains from South America or Southern Hemisphere's winter. And that's how it goes, right? So the Southern Hemisphere watches our flu season and makes their shots based on that. We watch their flu season and make our shots based on that. And so that means you can still get flu if you get the flu shot if it's not one of those strains. Okay? So, flu evolves rapidly, and it kind of is hard for us to detect. So, get your flu shots. They said September we should start getting our flu shots. Do it this year, even if you don't usually. The flu is really common in human populations. So, if you don't get the vaccine, as an adult, you have a 10% chance that you'll get the flu this year. Children, 20%. So a 1 in 5 chance that an unvaccinated kid will get the flu. Of course, if you have a kid in your household, your risk is higher than 10%. And then the third one I want to talk about is typhoid. Okay, the dreaded typhoid Mary. So typhoid is actually a bacterial infection due to a specific type of salmonella. You get a high fever, weakness, abdominal pain, constipation, headaches, mild vomiting. You feel bad, and you can feel bad for a very long time. Okay, if it's untreated, your symptoms may last for months. One of the things with typhoid is that with typhoid, you can get asymptomatic carriers. Okay, and asymptomatic carriers are one of those things that make a disease extremely effective. So what makes an effective disease? Well, with smallpox, you can be extremely contagious. Okay, with influenza, you can mutate rapidly, right? And have low mortality. If you have a low mortality rate, then you can be in the population at a very high concentration, and you're not killing hosts, so you can just stay there. And then with typhoid, you can get asymptomatic transmission. That means someone doesn't know they're sick and they're spreading it. You can start to think about why COVID's being very effective. So because it's a bacterial infection, typhoid, we can now usually treat it with antibiotics. However, antibiotic resistance is growing. So bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics. Same way a virus mutates, right? It's basically just mutations happening when things replicate. Something happens that, because there's millions and billions of replications of a bacteria, something happens that keeps it from being susceptible to the antibiotic. That one is going to be able to replicate itself more because it's not dying, and antibiotic resistance grows. So we're worried that we don't have the same capacity to treat typhoid as we did. It's got a semi-effective vaccine, so it's like 40 to 90% effective depending on who you are, and it lasts a couple of years. So it's better than nothing. If you're going into an area where there's a lot of typhoid's endemic, I recommend getting the typhoid vaccine. But it's not perfect, and very few vaccines are. Without treatment, typhoid has a 20% mortality rate. If you get good treatment, it's 1 to 4% mortality rate. Okay, so with treatment, right, we're talking something. Okay. It's estimated that worldwide there are about 150,000 deaths per year of typhoid now, currently. But historically, it was a much more important cause of death. So because of those diseases and, many more, like, I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, as European explorers and colonists ventured deeper into the Americas, they brought disease everywhere they went, okay? And that led to demographic collapse, okay? That meant the populations just collapsed. People died at astronomical numbers. So what we saw in the Caribbean, where 75 to 90% of the Taino were dead within 100 years, that repeats itself over and over and over throughout the entire process of exploration and colonization in the Americas. So we go back to Mexico, Montezuma and Cortez. Now, this is one of those stories, a lot of these stories, I find so interesting how these first contact stories were originally taught to us. So in 1519, Cortez reaches the Yucatan. And I think a lot of us were taught that, and they thought that they were like gods, and they thought that they were, the Europeans were magic or whatever, and not really. I think probably more than likely what happened is like some of the one or two village people were like, hey, after he had landed and they were talking to him and stuff, they were like, it's funny. There's this story in our religion about like white gods coming across the ocean. Isn't that funny? And Cortez, had such an ego on him that he loved telling that story about how they thought he was a god. And his contemporaries will be like, God, he was such an ass. Like, He just thought he was the coolest thing that had ever come along and just loved telling these stories about how, oh yeah, the Mexicans, they all thought I was a god. And they were like, he was just an asshole, okay? So here's the thing with Cortez. The governor of Cuba was basically the Spanish official in charge of the Americas, okay? And the governor of Cuba said to Cortez, don't you dare go to Mexico. I do not want anyone going to Mexico. Cortez was convinced that Mexico was where he needed to go, so he basically stole some ships, stole some men, sailed to Mexico, and as soon as they got there, they burned the ships. And he told the men, you cannot go back. We cannot go back because we are now traitors and deserters. So we gotta figure out how to deal with the Aztecs because we can't go back to the Spanish empty-handed. They'll kill us. He's a crazy person. So, okay, well, first thing he tries to do is demand a meeting with, the Aztec Emperor Montezuma. And they're like, who are you, bro? Like, no. Montezuma didn't think he was worth his time. He was like, I don't know who that guy is and I don't really care. Like, no, I'm busy. So Cortez goes back. Do you remember last lecture we talked about how the Aztec Empire had a problem? It had political factions within it, okay? So Cortez goes and rallies the vassal states that were very upset at Montezuma for taking their stuff and gets them to join his cause. So I always see these stories where it's like Cortez and 600 men took over the entire Aztec Empire. Like, wow, not to be white supremacist or anything, but whites really are supreme, aren't they? Yeah, that's not what happened. What happened was he was able to aggravate a split that was already there. And so he came in to Tenochtitlan with a huge army of other Mexican people. All right? That's how he did it. So he does this, he comes in, and they're like, oh, God, we need to deal with this guy. So they give him a whole bunch of gold, hoping he'll go away, because originally he was like, I just want all the gold. But that's not what he wanted, because he was who he was. So he takes Montezuma hostage and essentially rules the Aztec Empire for a while, like Weekend at Bernie's style. He's got Montezuma, but Montezuma's doing, anything that Cortez says because he's got him hostage. The governor of Cuba is pissed off. He can't believe this is happening. He can't believe that this guy defied him. He can't believe that he has taken the emperor hostage. He's just freaking out. So he sends his men to go get Cortez out of there. Okay, basically to rescue Montezuma. Cortez still has enough support that he has his army, right? His vassal state army. And they meet the Cubans and he destroys them, kills a lot of people, manages to take the ones that he didn't kill and have them join his forces. Cortez wins. But now Cortez is pissed off. He's mad. So he goes back to Tenochtitlan, he kills Montezuma, and people start to riot because, this random guy just killed their leader. And so he destroys Tenochtitlan. He destroys it. He burns it to the ground. He has his people smash all kinds of statuary, religious objects, whatever they could find. And he remains the self-proclaimed governor of Mexico for 3 years until Spain finally goes, you know what? You did do good work. We'll take Mexico. We'll recognize you because, that's the kind of leader we want. So this is the Templo Mayor complex that they've been excavating in Mexico City. And as part of trashing Tenochtitlan, the Spanish destroyed as much of the temple complex as they could, and then just built houses over it and used it as a dump. That's how much respect they had for the Aztec Empire that came before them. Okay? And the same thing happened in Mexico. Demographic collapse. Okay, so first you had a wave of smallpox, and then you had 2 waves of this Listli, which is basically, it's a relative of typhoid. Okay, so in 1520, the year that Cortez shows up in the Yucatan, you have almost 22 million people living in Mexico. And 100 years later, you've got less than 2, close to about 1 million. 22 million to 1 million people in 100 years. That's amazing. The population just collapsed, the native population. Meanwhile, down in the Incas, after Montezuma and Cortez and Mexico was such a success, Pizarro goes to the Spanish and says, well, I want to go see if I can take care of the Incas. And this time the Spanish are like, yeah, go ahead, be like Mexico. That was cool. We're rich now, and we don't care at all about these people dying. So, much like the Aztecs, the Incas were divided internally. So they were actually in the middle of a war of secession. You had Atahualpa, who was the official leader, and his brother fighting over who was actually supposed to be the emperor of the Incas. So into that vacuum comes Pizarro. And Pizarro, does this, I'm going to invite Atahualpa to dinner, but he ambushes him instead, and he, the story is really weird. It's like he, ambushes him and pushes a Bible in his face, and it's like, become Christian now! And Atahualpa, pushes the Bible down and is like, no, man, I'm not going to go under Spanish rule or Christianity. And so for that, Pizarro takes him prisoner, and now starts this big war, okay? And you've got a war you've got the Spanish, and you've got Atahualpa's Inca army, but then you've got his brother's Inca army who were kind of in with the Spanish, and so you've got all of this fighting. You've got a civil war basically happening, but Spain is paying into one side, and so it's very similar. It's related to the proxy wars we talked about last week, right? Where you had a civil war kind of happening, but it would not have been so bad. You would not have had the same kind of casualties or outcome if you didn't have a large, rich power from outside pouring money, gas on the fire, right? So this is the famous Atahualpa brings 24 tons of gold for his ransom, but that wasn't enough for Pizarro. Pizarro puts him in a Spanish court, which is considered not at all a court. It's just, a theatrics. And they put him on trial for high crimes, treason, because while he was emperor of the Inca Empire, he didn't recognize Christianity or Spain as his leaders. They sentence him to death, and they kill him. And Pizarro basically becomes governor of Inca territory. He does the same thing as Cortez and assumes that position. And everybody dies of European diseases. So in 1520, when Pizarro shows up, you've got 13 million people. And 60 years later, you've got 1 million people. Again, a huge amount of death in the wake of the conquests. And you had a lot of death in these areas because of war and because of poor resources and stuff. But the reason you see this huge collapse, these 95% decreases in the population, is largely because of these diseases. Okay, so disease is an opportunist. And anytime that there's chaos, diseases will squeeze in and proliferate. Okay? You will see poor health go where there is chaos. And you will see chaos go where there is poor health. And It has been very strange to me to watch people try to distinguish health and the economy as two different things that are against each other when they go together in all cases. You can't have a healthy economy with sick people, okay? It doesn't work. So, okay, so let's talk about North America. We've talked about Central America, talked about South America. Now we've got these British people, okay? Now we're not talking about the Spanish. We're talking about the British, okay? They are in North America, Roanoke Colony. So, in the late 1500s, Queen Elizabeth I gives her go ahead and explore and settle in unclaimed North America. By the time the British decided they wanted to colonize, they had a little bit of territory in the Caribbean, but really, a lot of the good territory was taken. What was left was North America, which was considered a bit of a desert. It's like cold and wild and weird, and we'll see later that they couldn't grow their favorite things here, okay? But there's still a lot of prestige in, having large areas of land and colonies. So, the original scouts are looking around, and in North Carolina, there's a group called the Secotan. They're Native Americans. They're friendly, and they're talking, and they're like, yeah, you guys why don't you guys try to have a town here, and yeah, that'll be fine. We won't attack you or anything. There's plenty of space. But in 1585, they set up the first colony there, and they almost immediately run out of supplies. So, here's the thing that cracks me up. This goes back to what we were talking about with, if you don't understand the land, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. So, I went to middle school and high school in Virginia, and so it makes me laugh that these European settlers would come into this area, this tidewater area that is famous for all kinds of food production, and starve to death because they didn't know what they were looking at. It looked like a desert to them, even though it wasn't at all. So the Native Americans were like, what are these people's problem? But they didn't know to eat a crab. They didn't know to find an oyster. They didn't know how to plant a corn seed. They didn't know what berries were poison. They didn't know what a peanut was. The Europeans were extremely helpless. And it didn't help that they were mostly sending over military guys and like random people they found at the docks. So these were not survivalists. They weren't sending Bear Grylls over. So you get the Thanksgiving story over and over and over and over. We always associate the Thanksgiving with that one story of the Pilgrims in Plymouth Colony, but it happened over and over and over and over. And so Manteo was the chief at the time of the Secotan, and they were like, look, you guys can't be starving, okay? Humans generally don't want other groups to starve if they can help it. If they have enough, they will feed you. And so that's what happens over and over and over. The Native Americans are like, hey, you guys don't look like you're doing very good. Can we help? Okay. But that only lasts for so long, okay? You get tired of supporting them. You can help them learn, but you don't want to actually have to keep giving them stuff because they won't do it on their own. So tensions rise by the next year, and the colony's abandoned. Okay? A year later, they decide they're going to try again. But they didn't actually fix anything. They didn't actually learn how to deal with this or farm or do anything. So very quickly, the same thing happens. Leadership tells the colonists, we're going to go back and get help. You just hang out here. Hang tight while we cross the ocean a couple times. 3 years later, the relief mission, 3 years later, the relief mission comes back to this village, this colony that they had set up, and this is where the story always gets hilarious, okay? Because the established story that I was taught learning American history was, it was abandoned, dismantled, and the only trace of anybody was the mysterious word Croatoan carved into a tree, right? Like this image, like, what is happening? Wow, it's such a mystery. It was not a mystery, you guys. The Secotan Indians, they lived on an island called Croatoan. This is like literally them leaving a note of where they went, okay? Colonists were like, we don't know what we're doing. We're going to go live with them. This is what they said, basically. I mean, it's like very clear. We're going to take our stuff. We're going to go live with them. They know what they're doing. And for decades, there were mysterious blue-eyed Indians in the area, right? Like blonde-haired, blue-eyed Indians, who of course were these colonists and their kids who were like, you guys don't know what you're doing. We're going to stick with the team that knows how to, like, find food, right? Now, why would they tell that story that way? Well, if you tell the story the real way, it makes the Europeans look, 1, ridiculous, 2, incompetent, 3, it makes the Native Americans look like they know what they're doing, which they did, right? Then you have to answer the uncomfortable questions about, well, if they knew what they were doing and they were so competent, why did they all die? Well, you know why they died. They died because they got smallpox, they got influenza, they got chicken pox, they got the cold, they got measles, they got mumps, they got these things that the Europeans carried with them that were generally not as deadly to the Europeans because they had some resistance, but were absolutely horrible for the Native Americans. All right? Jamestown, we're going to talk about Jamestown. I have a weird obsession with Jamestown. I apologize. Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in the United States, okay? So Roanoke was the first, but they couldn't make it go. Jamestown was the first they were able to make a go of it, but it was a disaster, y'all. So 1607, the colonists arrive at Jamestown. They're set up their town in the heart of Powhatan Confederacy, okay? Led by the powerful Chief Powhatan, who was the father of Pocahontas. Powhatan had heard about these guys, all right? Powhatan was not as welcoming as the Secotan Indians, okay? So Powhatan basically issued an order that said, watch them, keep them on that spit of land that they're on, don't let them get off and spread around, but don't go talk to them or, like, mess with them. Just leave them alone. The area was uninhabited because it was really awful. It was marshy and terrible, and it was too poor for agriculture. Like, the Native Americans weren't living there because they understood the land, and they knew that it was a bad piece of land, okay? And again, the settlers had no idea what they were doing. Again, they were like London dock trash and, like, military people. And I say this with love. This is my family came through Jamestown in the early 1600s, and they were 100% London dock trash. I'm not trying to be offensive. That is who they were. So, initially, after a little bit of the native people, like, kind of in the area were a little bit generous, but then Powhatan came through and said, like, no, like, these people, we cannot be dealing with these people. I don't like these people. I don't trust them. And part of what made Powhatan more hard-edged than what you had seen with the Secotans was that you had a drought happening at the time. So we're back to that old tension of who has water, okay? When water's scarce, tensions rise. And so that was part of what was going on, was you also had a drought happening, and there wasn't a lot of food to share. So within this 1 year, 80% of the colonists at Jamestown died, all right? So this is someone else's chance. So everybody, let me put it this way. At the beginning, everybody was dying like flies. So the Native Americans were dying, but so were the Europeans. Everybody was dying all the time. It was a very bloody endeavor, colonizing the Americas. Mostly this was from starvation and disease. The main disease here was malaria, okay? So, this is a little hint for where we're going next. Our third lecture, we're going to be talking about hemorrhagic diseases. And this led to cannibalism, okay, at Jamestown. They were starving and they were eating their dead comrades. Some of the survivors were deserting to go live with the Native Americans. I would say some of the smarter people. And then you have a war between these two. And it finally ends when the colonists ransom Pocahontas back to her dad. So was Jamestown a success? Some people will tell you Jamestown was a smashing success. I would say if you're eating each other and you're ransoming children, you may not be the good guys. But hey, by the way, what happened to Pocahontas? Do y'all know? They kept making sequels to that movie, and it was making me uncomfortable because I was like, you can't make too many sequels. Because what happens is she gets taken to England, she gets either pneumonia or dysentery, right? These European diseases, and then dies in England, like, very fast. Okay? Demographic collapse happened in North Carolina, happened in Virginia. Guess what? It even happened in Hawaii. So they didn't get to Hawaii until 1778. That was one of the last places that the Europeans got themselves into. When that happened, the native Hawaiian population dropped from 700,000 people to about 5,000, or what is it? No, not 50,000 people. Okay? That's a huge drop. It's just over and over and over and over. In Canada, in Alaska, in South America, you find these demographic collapses. Okay? Everywhere. This is just a hallmark of this time. Europeans were filthy and were making everybody else sick. So the native people in North America have had a rough go of it, y'all. It's been a rough time. And the option was always, do you assimilate or do you segregate? It was never you're equals, let's build something together, or even this is your land, can we be part of this or your system? It was never that. It was always white supremacist. And the height of that, maybe the most symbolic moment of that for us in the United States is the Trail of Tears, when you have these 5 tribes removed from all over the South and pushed into Oklahoma. So one of the things to remember is a lot of the time when you're talking about Native American reservations, people will try to tell you, oh, well, they're on their land. They're not on their land. Most of the reservations are not actually on the land that was the Native American land. Okay? And so that was the idea with this, was either you could assimilate, you could stay where you were and get rid of all of your Native American culture and heritage and live like a white person, including taking a white name and all of that. Or you could segregate, you could go live far away from everybody else. Those were your options. And it was very sad and very difficult. And of course, the economic opportunities of people on reservations is very limited. The social development, social safety net, very limited. These tribes recently had a big victory as far as how much territory they have in eastern Oklahoma from the Supreme Court. But it's still a very difficult life living in the reservations. Okay? So starting in the early 1800s, you have these Native American groups coming in and living in Oklahoma and figuring out how it works. And 40 years later, they opened up Oklahoma to white settlement. Okay, the Sooners, right? It was one of the weirdest stories of settling in the United States, where they had all the colonists line up on the border of Oklahoma, and then, like, bam, at midnight, everyone got to run across and find a place to squat, basically. How does that go outside of, right, taking land and stuff from Native Americans? Well, that's basically how you end up with the Dust Bowl. Okay? Once again, the colonists, the settlers, didn't understand how this land worked. They didn't have ecological farming practices. They had no history of dry land farming. They came in for about 40 years and ripped all of the grasses out, ripped a bunch of the trees out, and just farmed like they were farming in Michigan. Well, Oklahoma's not Michigan, and Oklahoma goes through intermediary droughts, okay? Sometimes there's droughts, and so you have to farm in a certain way to preserve the land. They weren't doing this. Big drought happens. All the soil blows away. And you have almost 10 years of serious crop failures and droughts that make themselves worse because all of the trees are gone. All the plants are gone. Just like we talked about in the Amazon rainforest, you get transpiration, you get your own kind of weather system going. You can make a drought worse, right, by using the poor farming practices. So, once again, you may want to listen to people about ecology of an area you're not familiar with. So, I'm going to end this lecture talking about what does it matter today. Okay, what does all this native stuff matter today? Okay, so in lecture 5, we're going to come back to Native Americans and we're going to talk about COVID, but my main research area, my dissertation is suicide. Actually, I look at suicide and race and ethnicity. That's my main area of expertise. And in the United States, white people have the highest, white non-Hispanic people have the highest rate of suicide, 18 per 100,000. But number 2 is Native Americans, AIAN, okay? That's American Indian Alaska Native. So American Indian Alaskan Native. That's what that means. And that is currently the nomenclature used by the CDC. Some people don't like Native American. Some people don't like American Indian. I encourage you to be flexible and just kind of respond to the situation you're in. So even though Native American suicide is lower than white suicide, it has some very specific differences that are really important. So one is age. So if you look at these charts, okay, you can see that the highest age of the age where suicide is highest in the Native American population is 25 to 34, and right before that 15 to 24. Very early adulthood, okay? If we go over to white, it's quite different. The highest is actually 45 to 54, and then it gets higher again as you get out to like 85 plus. So white suicide tends to be an older phenomenon, while Native suicide tends to be a younger phenomenon. The other big difference is the level of urbanization. So from a large central metro, so extremely urban, out to rural, white suicide increases a little bit, okay, between the inner city and the suburbs. But if we look at AIAN, all right, American Indian Alaska Native, then you see that there's a huge increase out to rural areas. That increase, okay, what do you think it reflects? Why is suicide among Native Americans so high in rural areas versus urban areas? And yeah, it's the reservations, okay? Reservations tend to be in deeply rural areas, and we see extremely high suicide rates on reservations. This is basically because people are losing their heritage, they have no opportunities, and in these situations, we're seeing a lot of drug addiction and depression and domestic abuse and basically these diseases of desperation. And suicide is also an outcome of desperation. So if we want to deal with Native American youth suicide, then we have to deal with the reservation system, which is, of course, a legacy of this assimilate or segregate policy towards indigenous people in the Americas that has existed from the moment that Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean. Whew. Okay. So, way to go. I will see you at the next lecture when we'll actually talk about the nitty-gritty of slavery. So, be ready for that.